Imagine being a German soldier captured by the enemy during one of the most brutal wars in history. You're far from home, separated from your comrades, and thrown into a prison camp. You've already seen the horrors of combat, but now you're facing something you never expected: the possibility of working for your captors. But here's the real kicker. Your captors tell you that you're going to get paid for your labor. Yes, paid. To any prisoner of war, this might sound like a cruel joke, but for thousands of German prisoners of war in the U.S. during World War II, it was a shocking reality. The American government, in desperate need of farm laborers after the war drained the workforce, found an unexpected solution: put the prisoners of war to work on American farms and pay them for it. For these soldiers, used to hardship orders and discipline, this new situation was almost incomprehensible. Here they were, in the heart of enemy territory, working the fields like any other civilian and getting wages, something they never thought they'd see again. It was surreal. They had come to the U.S. as enemies, and now they were treated as something more human. But why was this happening? How could the same country that had been fighting them for years suddenly offer them such a strange, almost generous deal? And here's the real question: how would the prisoners of war react? Would they see this as an opportunity or something to exploit? Could it be a chance for redemption? Or would they see it as just another form of manipulation? The idea of German prisoners of war working on American farms wasn't just an accident. It was part of a larger, desperate strategy. The United States, in the midst of a war that drained its workforce, was facing a shortage of labor, especially in agriculture. The fields needed to be harvested, crops needed to be planted, and the American soldiers and civilians were already stretched thin with war efforts. So, in 1943, the U.S. government struck a deal that no one could have predicted: put the prisoners of war to work and pay them for it. At first, the prisoners of war were skeptical, even suspicious. Many had been captured on the front lines in places like North Africa and Italy. Now, they were being transported to rural American towns, miles away from the battlefield and even farther from home. The transition from battlefield to farm field was jarring. These men were used to uniforms and combat, not picking crops or fixing fences. It was surreal, and many couldn't believe what they were hearing when they were told they'd be paid for their labor. But the money wasn't the only shock. These German soldiers, who had grown up in a totalitarian regime, were now in a democratic country where even the lowest-ranking prisoners of war were treated with a strange level of decency. They had food, they had shelter, and they were being given time off on Sundays. In Nazi Germany, the idea of a prisoner getting paid for their labor would have been unheard of. The contrast was staggering. Some of the prisoners of war, particularly those who had been forced into the German military out of desperation, started to see this as an odd form of redemption. Could this be an opportunity to show that they were more than just soldiers in a failed cause? Could they prove to themselves, and maybe to the Americans, that they had value beyond the battlefield? But not all of them felt that way. For some, this was just another phase in their captivity, a reminder of the brutal irony of war. How could they ever reconcile this strange, peaceful work with the things they'd done before? And yet, as they worked side by side with American farmers, the lines began to blur. Would the prisoners of war grow to appreciate this odd kindness? Or would they see it as a necessary evil to get through the war? Would they keep their distance, or could they find some unexpected camaraderie in the quiet, sun-soaked fields of America? As the weeks passed, something strange began to happen on those American farms. The German prisoners of war, many of whom had been hardened by the brutality of war, started to settle into their new routines. The work was grueling, long hours under the hot sun, picking crops, repairing fences, and tending to livestock. But it was also steady, predictable, and it allowed them moments of peace they hadn't felt in years. The farmers, too, were experiencing a shift in their perceptions. Initially, many were uneasy about having prisoners of war working alongside them, but as time went on, a subtle camaraderie began to develop. There was something unexpectedly human about it. The prisoners of war, for all their training as soldiers, were just men. They laughed with the farmers over shared meals, even if they didn't understand each other's language completely. They helped each other with the heavy lifting, and when they took their breaks, they talked, sometimes about the war, sometimes about their families back home. One prisoner of war, a young man named Hans Müller, found a strange kind of peace in these moments. Hans had been forced into the Wehrmacht as a teenager, and by the time he was captured, he'd seen the horrors of the Eastern Front. The last thing he expected when he'd been taken prisoner was to find himself spending his days in the warmth of a Midwestern farm, working alongside strangers who spoke a language he didn't understand, but whose kindness spoke louder than any words. One day, as he worked beside a farmer named Joe, who had no love for Nazis, but had no real hatred for these men either, Joe shared a simple but profound truth. "We're all just trying to survive, kid." It wasn't an apology, nor was it an endorsement of the war. It was just a quiet acknowledgement of shared humanity. For Hans, and many others like him, the realization was staggering. These Americans, his enemies just a few months ago, were showing him more compassion than he had ever received from his own countrymen. Could it be possible? Could a man fighting on the wrong side of history find some redemption, some meaning through this unexpected labor? But even as they worked, the brutal realities of war hung over them. They were still prisoners. They still wore the same uniforms. And when the war ended, would the respect they had earned through their hard work be enough to erase the scars of conflict? Or would they go back to being nothing more than soldiers in an unforgiving system? When the war finally ended in 1945, the German prisoners of war working on American farms found themselves in an even stranger position. They had spent years fighting for a regime that had promised glory and victory but delivered nothing but devastation. Now, as the war wound down and the world began to pick up the pieces, they were faced with the uncomfortable reality of what it meant to be a prisoner of war, and, in many cases, the awkward grace of having been treated with respect by the very people they had fought so fiercely against. The American farmers who had worked alongside them didn't forget the quiet dignity many of the prisoners of war had shown during their time on the fields. They had seen these men, who had once been enemies, become something else entirely in the midst of all the violence. They had become workers, just trying to get through the day. In fact, many of the German prisoners had forged bonds with the farmers and even developed mutual respect. Some farmers, who had once feared the men in uniform, now found themselves bidding farewell to these enemy soldiers with a handshake and a quiet word of gratitude. "Good luck," one farmer told Hans Miller as he left the farm for the final time. "We've got a lot in common, more than you think." For Hans, and many others like him, the irony was heavy. They had been soldiers under a banner of hate, but their experiences on those farms had shown them something different, that kindness, understanding, and even forgiveness could thrive in the most unlikely of places. They had come to America to be prisoners, to face harsh conditions and brutal realities. But they had left with something far more powerful, a glimpse of humanity in the midst of war. When the prisoners of war returned home, many had trouble reconciling the warmth they had felt in America with the cold ideology they had been raised on. Some quietly questioned everything they had believed in, while others never spoke of the experience again. But the lesson wasn't lost on those who had lived it. Some of them carried the memory of those American fields with them for the rest of their lives, a reminder that sometimes redemption doesn't come in grand gestures, but in small, humble acts of humanity. For the Americans, it was a reminder of the deeper truth that runs through all wars. Sometimes the enemy is just another person caught in a system far larger than themselves. And maybe, just maybe, the most lasting victories are the ones fought not on the battlefield, but in the quiet moments of understanding and compassion.